record retained on the council website for up to 2 years. By participating in this meeting, you are consenting for your name, the content of what you say, and your image to be broadcast and stored to the council website. If any member, officer or member of the public addressing the committee has concerns with this, please contact the committee services officer immediately. For those at home viewing the webcast, I'd like to inform you that if you look above the video, you will see a resources tab. Select this and a link to the agenda will appear in the right-hand side. This will allow you to open the agenda in PDF form and follow the discussion and debate. Thank you. Next item is apologies, and I have had one apology sent from Councillor Liz Gray. Councillor Carl Green is deputising. Number 3 is Members' Code of Conduct, so I'd like to ask members to consider whether they have any disclosable pecuniary interests and or any other relevant interest in connection with any items on the agenda, and if so, declare them and state the nature of the interest. Okay, thank you. Item number 4, public and member questions. 4A, public questions, none received. 4B, statements and petitions, none received.
Chair, sorry, could I just come in on the public questions, please? Thank you. I have received a question today from one of our residents, Mr Brace, who I believe will be watching this evening, but it was too late to receive questions. So I just wanted to thank him for his email, and officers will provide an answer just as soon as possible. Thanks.
Thanks, Julie. Okay, and questions by members has been non-received. So we're going to go on to the Section A, Budget and Performance Management, Pre-Budget Setting Report 2022-23. Chair Hale, would you all going to present that report? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Evening, members. So I wanted to bring this report to the committee today to assist the committee at the earliest opportunity, really, in its role in setting the budget for full council for next year, 22-23. I wanted to bring as much information as possible to the committee with what we currently know, so what's currently known at the moment, that will input into that budget setting process, to provide an update on the work that's been undertaken so far, the next steps for the committee to consider in taking its decisions for next year 22-23 budget. In preparing the estimates and considering the assumptions for the 22-23 budget, there is still a significant budget gap of just under £31 million, and this is based on a pessimistic scenario. Further work needs to be undertaken, therefore, as soon as possible to ensure plans are ready to meet this gap in advance of any further information becoming available that will update those scenarios. The services that the council currently provide are not affordable past April 22 because of that gap. And if any or part of that gap is not able to be mitigated between now and the time we set the budget, this will require a fundamental review of all council services to ensure a reduction in those services of up to that figure of 31 million to ensure that a balanced budget can be agreed when we go into the budget process next year. Past 22-23, work is already underway to address a structural budget deficit and to ensure that we can demonstrate that financial sustainability over a more of a medium to long term. The report covers a number of items, Chair, the current financial context and the work being carried out in the directorates that will have an impact on the budget, the timetable for the next steps in setting the budget, a set of principles to be included within the medium-term financial strategy, the approach for budget consultation this year, and to also formalise the establishment of the finance subcommittee. And I'll go through all of these in a minute in a bit more detail individually. The report is quite lengthy, but I would like to cover it in a bit more detail tonight to ensure that the committee are aware of the current financial position and also the committee's responsibility in ensuring that the budget can be agreed and balanced at full council next year in February. So just as part of the background, information has been provided by each of the individual directorates as to what activity is currently being undertaken that in their own areas that contribute to the Wirral plan, and that will impact on the 22-23 budget and, as I mentioned, the longer medium-term financial plan. In some of the cases in the directorate context highlighted, Some of these items may have already been the subject of discussions and approval in those policy and services committees already, so they may have come forward and have been agreed. They may have already been discussed in the separate budget workshops, and some of them may have actually already been to Policy and Resources Committee for approval already. This section, it really provides a bit of context into how the directorates are contributing to the longer term financial sustainability of the council. And the chairs of the Policy and Services Committees actually may be able to provide some more detail on these areas as we get into questions a bit later on. In terms of the approach then to budget setting for 22-23, this commenced as soon as actually this year's budget, the 21-22 budget, was set. And I presented a report to this committee on the 17th of March this year that highlighted a list of proposals for savings and income, and also areas that we're presenting as pressures and growth. At that time in March, we had a 5-year balanced medium-term financial plan, and this was a requirement of the former Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, so MHCLG. This was a requirement from them in order for us to submit our request for exceptional financial support, or also known as capitalisation directive, for this year, for 21-22, to enable us to balance a budget, an agreed budget for this year. Those savings proposals that were included in that report in March, I've included them just as a narrative in Appendix 5, just as a refresher for the committee. At the time in March, I did inform the committee that the figures in that 5-year plan were estimates. All of the proposals that were in the plan will be subject to consideration by the Policy and Service Committees in the budget workshops throughout the summer. And I also informed the committee that the figures included in that plan would, with absolute certainty, change as they were further developed. They were only estimates at the time, and they were our best knowledge of the estimates and figures that we had at the time. And actually, since March, some of those savings proposals are now considered to be unachievable, either in full or in part, and some of the pressures that we found have increased sometimes significantly. Some new pressures have materialised, and these 3 items really, so the savings proposals that are not achievable, the increase in pressures and new pressures that have materialised are now contributing to that budget gap that I mentioned at the start. And that's the change in the balance position that we presented at Policy and Resources Committee in March. So in terms of what's happened since that report, during the summer there have been 12 budget workshops taken place to consider those proposals that were included in that draft plan. And 2 reports have been presented to this committee for consideration. The final outturn report for last year, which was the year 2021, and also the first quarterly monitoring report up to the end of June for this year, 21-22, in which any known additional or any increase in pressures have been factored in to that revised medium-term financial plan that's included in this report today. I asked the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy, or CIPFA, to support us, and they were engaged early on to support in the preparation of the savings proposals business cases, as an independent sort of review to make sure that we were on the right track and make sure we were looking in the right area and they were robust, and also to undertake a benchmarking analysis to determine whether the services we provide in cost terms, how they compare to our statistical neighbours. And all this information, it's in the process of being completed at the moment, will further come back and then assist the committee in the decision making for the 22-23 budget. Just in considering the robustness of the budget proposals for 22-23, the CIPFA Financial Management Code, which I do need to take into account each year, I've actually placed a lot more focus on the content of the code and ensuring this year that we can adhere to the code. And the CIPFA Financial Management Code requires the council to demonstrate that the process followed in setting the budget and monitoring the budget satisfies the principles of good financial management, and those principles are outlined in the report. And as I say, I've put a bit more focus on actually making sure that we adhere to those for this year. So actually, despite a good early start, much engagement through the summer with the Policy and Services Committees, there is still a lot more work to do. And one of the recommendations in this report is to formally establish the Finance Subcommittee. The Finance Subcommittee is already included in the Constitution, but it's actually never been convened. Now, within the March report to Policy and Resources Committee, there was an approval for a budget subgroup. However, following the March report, we went into the local elections and the new municipal year that commenced and the activity that commenced in June of this year, we went actually immediately into the budget workshops, into the policy and services committees. So that activity had overtaken the agreement for the finance subgroup, and as a result, that subgroup was actually never convened. So the recommendation is now to formally convene the Finance Subcommittee, which is included in the Constitution. There is some suggested terms of reference for this Finance Subcommittee that's included in Appendix 6. And its focus really will be on reviewing and providing challenge to the assumptions which are included in the report today and are included in the medium-term financial plan. The scenario analysis that I mentioned just before. That subcommittee will also review the business cases coming forward from the individual policy and services committees to make sure that any proposals in there are robust and deliverable and legal. And that's both for savings and income, but also for pressures and growth as well, to make sure that we have the evidence available to support the pressures and the growth. To input into the development of the medium-term financial strategy, which will come to this committee for approval in December. Consider where further savings will be made to balance the budget and meet that budget gap. And that would include consideration of maybe setting targets as well for individual committees, so providing them with a savings target that they have to make. And also considering where multi-year savings can be agreed in full council at February that actually go forward across future years, so we're not doing a stop-start approach to a one-year budget setting process every year. So where we can actually agree some multi-year savings, that subcommittee can actually have a look to see whether anything would be appropriate in there. In setting the medium-term financial strategy then that I mentioned, this strategy is reviewed and updated every year. And along with the medium-term financial plan, it's actually a rolling strategy that will always look at 5 years in advance, and a new year will automatically be included after the current year has ended. The medium-term financial strategy, or MTFS, this is usually presented to full council at the time that we set the budget in March. But actually this is too late, because the medium-term financial strategy sets out the focus and the steer to set the coming year's budget. So it needs to be approved before the proposals and the themes are considered, before the next year's budget setting process is actually underway. So as I say, this year this will come to this committee in December for approval, to enable that strategy to inform the budget process. There is a set of guiding principles that are included in the report today for recommendation. And if approved, these principles will give a steer for the strategy and how the council can ensure that financial sustainability in the future. I mentioned earlier about the budget gap for 22-23 based on a pessimistic scenario. So in providing the assumptions to you for the budget for next year, I've compiled 3 scenarios based on a pessimistic, a mid-ground and an optimistic scenario. These are included in detail in Appendix 3, and they are based on the most up-to-date information that we have at the moment. The pessimistic scenario assumes that we have no increases in the main in most of our government funding for 22-23, and that there will be no increase in the council tax cap of 1.99% of increase in council tax. This scenario also assumes that current pressures will be at the highest level, and some of this information actually in terms of our pressures won't be known until later on in the year. For example, the increase in the Mersey Travel Levy and the increase in the Waste Levy comes quite late in the year, in December, a draft, and then it's not approved until the next calendar year. The mid-ground scenario then assumes, well, it's an improved position on the pessimistic scenario, obviously. I do want to make it important to note today, and it is important to note, that the mid-ground is not the most likely scenario. It's just a halfway point between the pessimistic and the optimistic scenario. So I wouldn't want the committee to automatically go to that mid-ground and assume, okay, that's most likely scenario, we're just going to look at that one and not kind of pay attention to the others. All of scenarios, as I said before, are only provided on best estimates that we have at the moment. But however, the three scenarios hopefully do provide the committee with a bit more context in terms of the uncertainty of the funding and the figures. And my advice is, as always, is that you plan for the pessimistic scenario and assume and plan for, at the moment, just over a £30 million budget gap in 22-23 until these figures can be firmed up in a bit more detail. So included within all the scenarios is an increase in general fund balances. And this is the first time this has been included within the budget setting. And this is either to increase the general fund balance to either 4% or 5% of the council's net revenue budget, depending on the required scenario. Members will remember and note that one of the reasons that we had to apply for the exceptional financial support was because of our low level of balances, whereas other local authorities who potentially will have been in the same situation as us, were able to use their balances and not apply for exceptional financial support. But because we had very low level, that was our only option at the time. And the council's external auditor, Grant Thornton, have commented previously on our low levels of reserves and balances, actually on several occasions. And as a result, my advice is to ensure that we do maintain a general fund balance of at least 4% of our net revenue budget from April 2022, and to increase this in year where there is scope to, and to include a further increase to 5% as part of the budget setting process for 23-24. And this will give us a bit of scope and to make sure that if any potential situation arises again, that we have got that scope and a bit of a buffer really to make sure that we don't end up in an exceptional financial support situation again. The report recommends the approach for public budget consultation this year, which is to ask the public this year what they value from the council across all of the services we provide, rather than provide them with a specific set of proposals that prohibits feedback on other areas of the council services. So section 3.10 in the report describes the type and the format of consultation that will be carried out. It will seek the views of all residents, businesses, staff, partners and any other interested stakeholders. And if agreed this evening, we'll start next week for a period of 6 weeks. And the format this year will include an online portal, a budget book, a survey, information through various social and digital media, and also a series of virtual events as well. And just to assure the committee, the communications team will ensure that the consultation has a range of different ways to feedback to make sure that it's inclusive to all the public in the borough. Finally, Chair, I just wanted to highlight the next steps in the report before I pause for questions. There is a timeline included in Appendix 4, but if agreed this evening, the Finance Subcommittee will be convened immediately to consider the information that we have so far on behalf of the whole committee. During November then, reports will be presented back to the Policy and Services Committees on the outcome of the budget workshops they've had. This will be in a high-level summary, so I won't go into too much detail because those proposals will still need to come to Policy and Resources Committee for agreement. In December, the outcome of the public consultation will be known, as will the Council's draft financial settlement, although the financial settlement is still expected to be quite late on in December. And then in January, this committee, via a series of budget workshops, will consider what the revised budget gap is following the notification of the financial settlement. We'll consider the proposals that have been submitted and considered by the Policy and Services Committees as part of the budget workshops, and we'll also consider the outcome of the budget consultation. And these three items will formulate the draft budget for 22-23 that will be presented to the Policy and Resources Committee in early February, and then be recommended onward to full council to set the budget in late February. Following the Policy and Resources Committee in February, there will then be a process for submitting budget amendments in advance of full council, and that process is described in Appendix 2. And just to round off, Chair, so I will, at every Policy and Resources Committee following after this evening, as further information is known, I will bring a further report back to the committee, an update report on those three budget scenarios and the revised budget gap, and give you an update on the changes that have been made since the information that's presented to the committee today. So I appreciate, I've just taken a bit longer there, Chair, just to describe all that in report, so I hope you found that useful, and I'll just pause for any questions now. Thank you.
Okay, so do I have anyone with any questions? Tom?
Thanks, Jeanette, and thanks, Chair, for the report. I've got a few questions, but I'll just go one at a time if that's all right, Chair. So the first one is on the consultation. I noticed the authority quite properly released a press release outlining the council's financial situation, but in that it was disappointing to note it didn't have balance in there in terms of the various possibilities that you've outlined. It just went for the worst case scenario. Which is disappointing really, because it can just scare residents, and that's a worst case scenario. I'm a bit confused now on the midpoint. It's not the most likely, but it's I just want a bit more information on what assumptions you're making there to get to that midpoint. And then the question is on the consultation. So will we include the various financial scenarios in that consultation? And what I mean by that is, if the worst case does happen, then residents might outline their first 2 or 3 priorities, but if it's a midpoint, they might have a further 5. And how will they know what to prioritise depending on what finances the council's given? And when we make that decision then in December at P&R, there's no then, from I take it, opportunity to go back out to further consultation, speak to those residents about what proposals we've come up with. So that's just a bit of concern on that one. I'll leave that question for now, and do have another couple, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. So yeah, on the consultation, I mean, as the committee will know, my job as Section 151 is to always report and present the worst case scenario, so the pessimistic scenario, and that is because if I get it wrong, and I am presenting a more favourable scenario to you, and it doesn't come out that way, it's a much worse position to be in, really. To have to backtrack to find more savings proposals if I get that wrong it will present a much worse position, and the timing of that as well will be really difficult for the committee to go back and find additional proposals. So my advice, I think I would say all Section 151s would all provide the same advice, is that we go for a pessimistic scenario, we develop proposals for the worst case scenario budget gap, and that in the event, hopefully then, where we can actually revise those proposals, revise the gap, then at least, we can knock some of those proposals off. So you've got choices and options in terms of the proposals that you provide. We need to be realistic with the residents and the people in the borough as well. We could well have a budget gap of just around about 30 million. That's on the figures that we've provided at the moment. I don't know whether it actually stated it was worst case scenario in the consultation documents. If it didn't state worst case scenario, I will make sure that's included in the consultation pack that goes out following the committee today. But as you know, in the past, I mean, today I've presented 3 options, but my advice is that we need to always go for worst case scenario in the event that things could actually become a bit better. Sorry about this. Can you just bear with me a second? Sorry, Chair. Apologies, yeah. Phil has tried to provide me with a helpful note, but I can't read his handwriting. Phil, I wondered if you could just clarify maybe on one of Tom's questions there. Thank you.
That may be wise on occasion, Chair. Chair, if I may, it was just picking up on the comment about a chance to go out to consultation again. So clearly this year the proposal is a wide-ranging consultation pre-budget to be able to set the parameters of that budget based on the public's priorities. That does still leave the opportunity to go out again, if necessary, with the actual estimates. There is in any event a small statutory duty on consultation on the estimates as agreed by P&R, i.e. you at some point will agree a draft budget. That goes through a mini consultation exercise in any event, so there may be an opportunity there to widen that out.
Okay, do you want to carry on?
Yep. Obviously, that will impact on the timeline that I just mentioned. You know, at the end of my presentation a bit there, we would need to revise the timeline to take into account for that. And what I would advise is that that's considered by the Finance Subcommittee to maybe do a revised timeline and plan all that in to make sure that we still have relevant time to go out for a meaningful consultation on those revised proposals.
Okay, thanks. Well, that's useful. So we know we're now going up for a further consultation. We need to revise the timeline. Just on the, look, I understand what you've just said about the worst case scenario, and maybe we wouldn't have to do that if we did have the balances that you advised and the district order advised previously. Just want to touch on the COVID budget. Because I don't think any of us have seen it in quite a while, and I'm sure there's still quite a bit left and reserves in that. And from an email you sent to another member really helpfully about the revenue costs of paying that the capitalisation directive back. From my understanding, you said in 21-22 we'd have to pay 375,000, 22-23 460. And then in 23-24, 1.2 million that it peaks, and then 24-25 it reduces by 100,000 a year. So, question then is, any of that COVID budget, how much is left? Where's the reserves? Maybe not get all the detail tonight, but where those money reserved to? Is it likely we're going to need it? And then can that be used to reduce the capitalisation directive and therefore less pressure on the revenue budget in years to come?
Yeah, thank you through you, Chair. I can definitely bring the that information on the COVID budget, what's left and what's been used back to the committee. I will plan that in for a future committee. But yes, you're right, is that we were able to get the exceptional financial support based on the COVID pressures that we have. So if there are any pressures specifically relating to COVID that we can reduce and we don't need to use any of the COVID funding for, that will have to go. So the former MHCLG have told us that will have to go to reducing our capitalisation, our exceptional financial support, or the capitalisation. We can't use it for anything else. So you're right, it will reduce our interest and MRP borrowing over that longer term, and that will make a saving for us, or it will reduce the cost in terms of the revenue account in future years. Yeah.
So just before I bring Jeff in, my understanding was that there was a working group that was looking at the COVID budget, and is that the same budget, or is this a separate one?
It's a separate one, Chair. So there is a working group that's looking at the contain outbreak management fund.
Oh, okay.
But this, I think, is specifically relating to the tranche funding.
Okay, thanks. Jeff, you're next.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Chair. Yes, so did I. So when I turned up to the meeting, I thought we were looking at the COVID budget. And lo and behold, we weren't. It was the outbreak element of it. Although the Director of Public Health did explain that we'd had more money than we expected. So, can I just welcome this report, if I may? It's not a question, more of a comment, I suppose. Can I welcome the report? Certainly someone who previously has chaired the audit committee. I am aware that we had consistently raised the point about, I suppose if you narrow it down to the structural issues within the council's budget, in terms of, and you'll remember this, Chair, because we raised it with you, in the fact we kept using one-offs to support the ongoing revenue budget. And that has its implication. So there is something structurally out of kilter with our budget. So I welcome what you've said about looking to fix the structural nature of the budget, of the structural budget deficit, and to deal with that. I'm sure it's going to take more than 1 year, but if we are approaching that, because I remember asking you questions about, well, and you'd say it's in the medium-term financial strategy, and then I'd say the year 8, but I thought this was in the medium-term financial. Well, they didn't do it, and I've now got a new one. So if there's going to be that all-council emphasis on fixing the structural budget, I think that's the structural budget deficit. I think that is welcome. I think there is, and Tom is onto something here, I think, in terms of the publicity. I mean, I read the press releases, as I'm sure everybody else did. The press release is one thing, and then we get into a consultation and the narrative at the front of the consultation. I think if you are, as you are, being honest with us to say there are a range of possibilities, and frankly, you're not sure which one it's going to be, because assumptions move. You know, we could all look at your assumptions about why worst case and say, well, that's not going to happen. We could look at your assumptions of best case and say that's ridiculous. Do you know what I mean? So there are a range of assumptions that will factor in. And I do think we can and we should be honest with the public to say, look, there are a range of things that could happen here. However, notwithstanding the range of things that could happen, and it could range from 10 million to 30, whatever it is, what we are interested in is what are your views and what do you value. So I think rather than scaring or seeking to scare the public to say, oh, it's going to be 30 million and so on, I think we're better being honest with the public and saying, you know, there are a range of possibilities here depending on what happens. And hopefully in the consultation we will, if it's an honest consultation, we'll be honest in terms of the narrative we place around it. I personally welcome the setting up of the committee. In a way, I would have preferred it to be a subgroup, because then we could have done it over Teams, and it probably would have been a bit more straightforward than coming here 3 or 4 times a week, or however often this is going to meet. But I do think it's a valuable idea, which is why, of course, we suggested it in our budget all that time ago. But anyway, it's good for a sinner to come to the light. So, as I say, I think it's important, and please we're going to address the deficit, the ongoing structural deficit. I think you're right in terms of looking at our balances. I think that's important, that we need to have balances. There needs to be some quite clear rules around balances. So what's a balance and what's a reserve, and what can be used for which. So there's some very clear rules with officers and committees around that. And I think, again, as Tom has pointed out, I think it would be really useful to have an update on the reserves, because, you know, at this group to look at the outbreak management budget that we'd had, it was clear that, you know, we were looking at the extra that had come through that was assumed. So I don't know, in terms of the overall, what there is in terms of, I know Councillor Camphor, for instance, said about long COVID and said whether we'd actually applied for long COVID money and so on. So it would be useful to have a very clear update on that. And also what reserves can be drawn down as we stand this year by the policy committees. So notwithstanding reserves were put in for 21-22, if we're in the worst case scenario, which you refer to, have you included in that worst case scenario that committees will draw down every item of the reserve that was allocated to them this year? Do you see what I mean? So I think just some of that is going to help with the clarity, but the underlying thrust of what's contained in this report, I think, is very sound, and I for one, certainly welcome it, so thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Green. Just to come back on a couple of points, I suppose, really. So I take both of your points, really, in terms of the range of scenarios being published in the consultation. And sorry, Councillor Anderson, I didn't address that when you asked me. It's already in the public domain. So the report today is in the public domain. So the public can see that we are presenting 3 different scenarios. So I have no issue, therefore, in including that within the consultation. They can already see that, so I'm happy to include that and speak to Comms about including that. And then just picking up on one other point about the subcommittee, the finance subcommittee. So even though it is a constituted subcommittee, we can have a subcommittee working group that doesn't have to meet in person, so we can meet on Teams, and then we can come back to a formal subcommittee for that as well. And yes, happy to provide information on reserves at a future committee, no problem.
That was actually a fleeting look of joy on my face before when we thought we might be coming here 4 times a week in person. Okay, so Phil Gilchrist.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just looking at this situation and thinking of all the other things that's going on. So when the public get their bill for council tax, they'll probably be getting it at the same time as they see changes in national insurance and other schemes that will happen to help them pay for social care in the future. So I think the public will expect us to look under every little nook and cranny or under every rug to see if we got anything hidden away. Because I haven't got a crystal ball. Because I do expect us on this working party or the subcommittee to actually go and look in all the hiding places, if you'll forgive that term, but to look at things we haven't looked at for some time. One of those is the issue of consultants, because we do get a regular email with an Excel spreadsheet from officers about which consultants are in post and why they're there. But I think the subcommittee needs to have a look at those to ask for justification. Whilst we get an explanation, I think we have to look at those. The other issue that always crops up is the use of reserves. Now, grants. The government has helped us in recent times, sometimes by giving us grants rather late on, or telling us what we get rather late on. So things like the adult care grant certainly helped this year with our care costs and the amount of work need to be done in adult care. So one issue that we need to always check on is how long grants are for and whether they're one-off grants or whether they're likely to be renewed. Ideally, if the government gives a grant towards care, we'd like it renewed, but we need to know in case there's anything lurking in any woodwork that is likely to lead us to come unstuck. So on the issue of consultation, well, I think what Cher's now saying, the comms is supposed to be going out around about November the 2nd based on the report we... Aren't you lucky? On November the 2nd. You can read it on your holiday, Jeff. On November the 2nd. So there's only a limited opportunity for Cher to talk to comms and get the narrative right, because the reality is that these things take time to design and print and write covering documents for, and they might be on the website, but there will be many groups who would like to see a paper version so they can sit down and discuss it. And so if there are changes to be made in the narrative, perhaps Cher can tell us how quickly that can actually be achieved, presumably within the next 48 hours or 60 hours, otherwise we'll miss the boat for publication times. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gilchrist. So, yeah, just on your first couple of points, really, I'll make sure that when we convene the first Finance Subcommittee working group, that those items that you've mentioned will go to that working group. Just in terms of the consultation, so in advance of and in anticipation of the committee this evening, we have already prepared all the consultation documents in draft. As you say, it takes a while to be able to do this, and there's lots of consultation internally, if you like, that we need to make sure that we've got it right, and that everything sounds about right and it looks about right. So it's more or less ready to go. So it shouldn't take too long in actually tweaking and making some changes. So I'll have a word with Gail tomorrow. Gail Mooney heads up our comms team, and we'll make sure that we can make those changes ready for it to go out, and we will hit that deadline of 2nd of November. I'm confident of that.
So sorry, just before I bring Pat in then, in terms of member oversight of the consultation before it goes out, where's that going to take place?
I mean, we can bring that to group leaders on Thursday. Yeah, if that
I'm going to say, could Gail send out to group leaders tomorrow so you can all have a read through, and then any suggestions or comments can be made on Thursday? Thanks. Pat?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. And just on that point, I do remember last year having that opportunity to comment on the consultation, which I certainly found useful, and I very much welcome that. Just my kind of comments on the report. I see the financial management code and the various principles there, and the first one that talks about demonstrating a clear strategic direction. And I think what we've heard tonight does kind of give us some reassurance around that. Obviously, it's not something that will be achieved overnight, but I think bringing forward the medium-term financial plan, giving us oversight of that at an earlier date, I think that would really help in that regard. The one thing that really struck me about reading the report was the amount of references to reviews. There's actually, if you do a word search on the word review, there's 29 reviews within the document. And I suppose the concern I had about that was reading through it, it kind of felt inevitable. This is a comment, not a criticism, that we're kind of firefighting rather than providing strategic direction. And I think that's what's kind of come through in the press release during the week, that we talked about the most pessimistic. I think that's the way it's phrased in the press release, rather than the range of outcomes that are available to us. So I think that feeds through to the public a little bit. And just one concern about the consultation is that, yes, asking people what they really value is fine, but as we know, some parts of the borough will be better equipped to tell us what they value rather than others. So there would be, I think, possibly an inherent bias in the consultation responses, and Cher did refer to ways of dealing with that. So I'd welcome a bit more detail on how exactly we might approach that particular aspect of the consultation. But I think in terms of providing strategic direction, what I think would help, it would help me, I think, members of the committee and members of the public, if we were able to provide on one side of A4 what is our summary of our financial strategic direction, that the public could see and easily absorb, because it's not particularly easy to absorb, because obviously it's quite a lengthy report, and not everybody's going to read it, obviously. But I think as part of the consultation, if we could think about that, about actually telling the public what is our strategic direction financially in very clear and simple terms. And just getting back to that point I made about the number of reviews, Appendix 5 gives a list of, I think, what we call work streams. And I think what struck me again about that was some of those items there have been knocking around for quite a while. We seem to be reviewing some things for quite a period. So I think that Appendix 5 would be a much more helpful appendix if it had kind of timelines attached to it. If we were told, well, this is a review of X and we expect it to be completed by Y, That would really, I think, help us to see how things are coming forward, to keep track of things, to question them, I think, more appropriately. So, given that we're doing so many reviews, and I do wonder about, do we need to review the number of reviews, because is there so much pressure on staff with all of these reviews? Are we actually prioritising the right reviews in terms of what we want to achieve for this year's budget and our budgets going forward? So I think adding deadlines to that particular table would be useful. In the recommendations it says, again, I don't really share particular joy at the prospect of more trips to the Floral Pavilion, but it does say a formal subcommittee or a working group. So I would certainly favour a working group, and not only for practical reasons, but just because I don't want to undermine this committee. So I think a working group is the way to go on that. I'm also struck by, it was mentioned, you know, the levies from Mersey Travel and the Waste Authority, and this comes up every year that we don't get them until quite late. And I wonder, is there not something that we can do? Now, I don't sit on Mersey Travel anymore or the Waste Authority, but is there something we cannot do to actually press these bodies to actually be a bit more timely in what they provide back to councils? Because it just comes up every single year that it's a problem for us. And you look at the implications of the Mersey Travel levy, for example, on our budget, and the various scenarios are very different. And you know, they're a significant part of the different scenarios that we're presented with in this paper. I do have one question. It relates to Appendix 4. We've got assumptions around inflation, optimistic and pessimistic, and I understand that is because the higher the rate of inflation that the expected rate of inflation that the government hands down, then the more funding in cash terms we would expect to receive. But the highest expectation amongst those scenarios is just 3%. Now, I looked today at the Bank of England's latest quarterly forecast, and they are anticipating that inflation will peak at 4% and then fall back to 2.2%. So it struck me that a kind of highest possible expectation for inflation of just 3% might not be actually the most appropriate. So I'm wondering where we get those expectations from, and whether we shouldn't really be looking at that a bit more carefully in the light of what we know today and what's happening with inflation, and what could happen going forward. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Cleary. Okay, I suppose just to come back and provide a bit of clarification on a couple of those items. In terms of the consultation and you know the requirement to get to everybody, you know, across all of the borough, I will get Gail head of comms to actually provide a note as to how, you know, we're going to do that and engage everybody with the consultation documents when that comes out to group leaders as well. So hopefully that will be covered in there. And I think a good point in terms of our financial strategic direction. There is something already included in the consultation documents that you'll see, but I'll have a chat with her tomorrow just to make sure it's succinct and it's easy to read and that people can understand it. In terms of the Appendix 5, the timelines, happy to put those on. There will be something coming back again, which will have our full medium-term financial plan. Most of these items will be for April 2022 to enable them to get into the budget process and make full year savings. But some of them do go along multi-years as well. So I will provide that timeline back for you, but back for the whole committee, so you can see that in a bit more detail. And just picking up the levies and pressures. So I meet with the Liverpool City Region Finance Directors fortnightly at the moment, virtually. And included on that meeting is the Finance Director for the Mersey Waste Development Authority and Mersey Travel. And I think it's fair to say we do give them quite a bit of pressure because we're all in the same situation. We all need to know, you know, what, how much it's going to be, how much the increase is going to be. So we do kind of put a lot of pressure on them, and they do try, you know, to provide us with a bit more information or a bit more updated information as soon as they can. They're generally bound by their own timelines with their own organisations, but yeah, I mean, you know, they are aware that as soon as they know a bit more information, they are under instruction to provide it to us. So I will chase them up on that. And then finally, your assumptions on inflation. So the inflation figures have come from our Treasury Management team. It may be, you mentioned then that the highest rate of Bank of England is 4, coming down to 2.4, I think you said. It may be that the reason we've got that 3% in the optimistic is sort of like an average or somewhere in between the two, to take into account that it might come down. But I think it's, you know, I will take that away and review those inflationary assumptions just to make sure that they are based on the most up-to-date information that we have. So yeah, thank you for that.
Thanks for that. Could I just make one comment based on what you said, and just on the consultation? I think it's really important we get, and I'm sure we will, but just to emphasise the point that we get feedback on a breakdown of responses by ward, ideally, where they're coming from. So I'm sure we'll get that, but just to make that point.
Helen?
Thank you, Chair. It was just, I was confused actually when Councillor Cleary mentioned the levies. So we're going to put the 3 scenarios out to the general public, and on the optimistic one, there's several thousand people would be very optimistic to have no increase in Mersey travel levies because they don't live anywhere near a train station and the buses are few and far between. So I don't understand why we would put out to consultation levies that have such a variation. I understand. So it was held for 1 year, surprisingly, when the Mayor was up for re-election, and then it was a 2 million increase, and now we're saying potentially there could be 0 increase. That's a huge range, and the waste levy, I assume that's on tonnage, and we knew that lockdown was exceptional, lots of people having a clear out. But why have they been modelled, and why would they just be arbitrary numbers going out to consultation?
Okay, thank you, Councillor Cameron. So I wouldn't advise that we go out for consultation on the individual items in all the 3 scenarios. I think when we go out for consultation, we just go out with the 3 gaps to say that, you know, our worst case scenario, our pessimistic gap is just over 30 million. We have a mid-ground gap, which is, I think it's just over 10 million, and then we have a balanced budget, which is the optimistic. So I think when we go out for consultation, we'll just reflect the fact that we have these 3 gaps, and that there's lots of factors that could impact on those gaps rather than going out individually for each one of those items. Because you're right, the public don't have any influence whatsoever on what those figures will be at the end. So really, you know, it wouldn't be any value in asking them, because they wouldn't feel that they were able to contribute to the influence in that. Just in terms of the 3 scenarios in both areas, so in terms of the waste levy, right, with we found that people's behaviours have changed as a result of lockdown. Lots of people more are buying goods online, so there's lots more recycling, which is good, you know, but then with it actually increases costs of people maybe going to the household waste disposals, waste recycling sites themselves, and increasing more of the tonnage into the skips there. So there's lots of things to factor in. At the moment, we've only got information based on what happened last year, and the Waste Disposal Authority are working through the figures as to what they're doing, their own scenario analysis as to what that could be. So what I've provided is kind of the best sort of estimate that we've got at the moment in terms of what that might be, and I think it's based on a percentage increase of what the waste tonnage increase would be over the 3 different scenarios. But again, you know, it's until they come back with some information, I can't really sort of review those and revise those down. Just in terms of the Mersey travel levy as well, I'm just finding that one. So in the past, depending on tunnel tolls, so depending on how much tunnel tolls are increased, if they are increased or if they are decided not to be increased, this does impact on the Mersey travel levy. So I think, you know, a 20p increase in tunnel tolls, I think, generates $1.5 million, £1.5 million worth of additional revenue. They have had reserves and balances previously as well that they've been able to use. It depends on the appetite of leaders and mayors, and you know what they want to set in terms of the Mersey travel levy. And they have got the new rolling stock as well now that they are looking. Well, I think they have rolled out already. So I think they're working through whether there's any impact of that and what that will look like for next year. So the worst case scenario, the pessimistic scenario, is just above an inflationary increase. Potentially, if they have to actually, as across the whole of the city region, if we have to fund additional costs of the rolling stock. And then the worst, the optimistic one is that actually they may well either put tunnel tolls up and or use all their reserves as well, that it will be a flat cost for us and won't be increased. Again, you know, until we have a bit more information on that, I don't know what that will be. So, but I'll say I will keep providing more updates to that as soon as we know.
Thank you. Sorry. Also, it was my understanding that the vast majority of the levy is interest payments on all the previous debt stacked on top of each other over the decades. So will we expect also a reduction because the population of the Wirral isn't increasing? Will we expect a reduction in relation to other parts of the city region? The population is increasing, and I believe it's worked out per capita, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a historic calculation as to how it is worked out. I can get the details of that to actually how it is worked out and what the impact is for those different scenarios. So as you say, if there's an impact of population, if there's an impact of tonnage, we can do a bit of analysis, and I can let you have a copy of that as to just how it will work out based on those different scenarios. So I'll provide that to you.
Okay, I don't actually see anyone else that wishes to speak. Sure, I've just got one thing which follows on, I think, from what Tom spoke about earlier, which is around the three various scenarios. I think the difficulty that I see is that if it comes to the point where it's evident we don't have to go with the worst case scenario, and various options have been scoped up in the respective committees, one committee might decide to drop the worst of the options, and that might happen across all the committees. But there could be a point where P&R might say, actually, no, our priorities on P&R are slightly different. So I just don't see, I think that's going to be really difficult for us as members, because if each committee was obliged to make X amount of savings, better case scenario than we thought, therefore not as many savings, how would that all come out in the wash? That's what I'm trying to ask. I think.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Chair. So it is ultimately the responsibility of Policy and Resources Committee to recommend a budget to full council. So while the Policy and Service Committees are going through this process of looking up options, bringing options to the table, all of the options that have been discussed at the Policy and Services Committees will come back to the Policy and Resources Committee for consideration. So even so at the moment, for example, I mentioned earlier that there have been some savings proposals that are now deemed as unachievable, either in full or in part. Where those savings proposals have been rejected or taken out by the Policy and Services Committees, all that information will come back to Policy and Resources to make sure you've got full oversight of all of the proposals and all of the things that have been discussed. And then it will be for yourselves as P&R committee to decide whether you actually do want to take some of those forward, or you might, as you say, you quite rightly say, you might have different priorities as to the ones that you actually want to recommend as a budget to full council.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, and you've just reminded me, actually, it's a really good point. I was going to ask about we're now revising the timescale in this recommendation because of the extra consultation. My question is, how's this going to feed into the committee cycles? And so once what Jeanette just said, it might be the case that we say to a committee, no, go back and look again, or this is the option we want to take. Will that have time then to go back to the committees, or are we just going to be in a perpetual cycle of, is this going to come to assume the committees are going to go to the subgroup, that's then going to come back to P&R, but will it then go back to the committees, and where does that fit into the timescale of consultations and things like that?
If I can answer that, Chair. So if you recall earlier on, I said about may do a wider consultation. So that timeline is set out here should not be unduly altered, so that there is this consultation, the full consultation. There is then the process of putting the draft budget together. There is then now built in a short statutory consultation, which is with a small section of the population, only certain business representatives. What I was saying is that if at that time P&R or the subcommittee felt that it was proper to do something a bit wider, it could, but obviously that would come back to P&R, because there wouldn't be time to go back around to all of the committees again at that late stage.
Chair, I'm now totally confused, because I'm just hearing now completely different what we heard earlier.
I apologise if it came across as totally different. That's what I meant earlier.
So, when I asked my question earlier, the Director of Resources just said we'd have to then factor in, extra consultation. You're saying it's now, and he did say, to be fair, small, but it's only limited to businesses. I would assume, or I for one would want, depending on the scenarios, to maybe go out and consult further and with a limited scope to the public, depending on what case scenario and what options are presented. So, maybe we can't do it right now tonight, but we do need to have a timescale in there that, in a chart that flows into where it goes into the committees, what consultation we go back to the committees, to the public on the various options, because otherwise we're going to be in the mess we were in last year.
Phil is answering that question. Can I just ask another? And I accept I'm probably, probably a couple of years out of date. But as I understood it, so we're going out for consultation broadly, what you like, what you value. Yep. That all comes back to us, and then collectively we have a look at that and decide how much we're short of, how does that match across with what people value, and so on and so forth. I understood that if we are to make significant changes to certain services, we have a legal responsibility to go out and consult on those changes. Or has that rule in itself been changed? Am I making any sense? But that used to be the case.
Understood. If I may, Chairman, I'll answer both of those questions. So, yes, if it's the will of committee to have another cycle of consultation, then, as said earlier, we'll go away and work up that alternate timetable and see what fits in where. There is, and we've often put this in the report to answer Councillor Green's question. He's entirely right that. So I know I shouldn't even have to say that, should I? But that's two separate decisions. So one is about setting the budget, which is the envelope. If that actually has a significant effect on certain services, then the committee or the officers responsible for that service will have an extra specific duty to make a much more informed decision about how that budget is delivered. Does that answer the question? Thank you, Chair.
Oh, I know. That was music to your ears, wasn't it, Jeff? I think you've answered mine as well. It was just trying to, because there could be, hopefully not, but there could be a scenario whereby one committee might have discussed and rejected some options on the grounds that that committee, or the majority of that committee, didn't want to go with them. But P&R could actually say, we want your committee to go with all of those options. And this other committee, whilst you've offered some, we're not going to take them. So that's a realistic scenario, isn't it? Okay. Just need to get that. Okay. Jean.
Thank you, Chair. Could I just ask, just so I've got my head around this as well, so in the timeline in October it says that so all committees would have set their budgets, or they've been at a budget workshop and they would have made their recommendations, because obviously we're at the end of October this week. So has that all been done, all the budgets, and all the committees have decided what their savings or will be by this week? Sorry, thank you.
Thank you. So all committees have had at least one budget workshop. Policy and Resources, for example, have only had one. So we do need to convene another one next month to actually go back, because the first workshop we had for Policy and Resources just identified the proposals. We need to go back now and tell you in a bit more detail and have a discussion over what those proposals are. Yeah, at the moment, all committees have had one workshop because of the budget gap. And if the budget gap stays the way it is, there will need to be more workshops convened by committees, because we will need to find more savings if we can't mitigate it by any other means. At the moment, my advice would be we need to go back for all of the committees to have more workshops to try and find those savings.
Thank you, Chair. So I know there's timetable in here for October, November, December, and obviously we're sort of discussing the P&R then sitting with the budgets. So will they be factored in for November as an additional committee items, will they?
They will,
Thank
yes.
you.
Yeah.
Tony?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I'm a little confused with what Chair's just said, because quite clearly, looking at the key items for the subcommittee to consider, that comment would be subcommittee consideration, which then feeds back into P&R, and not P&R consideration feeding back to a subcommittee. And I'm talking about review business case from policy and service committees to ensure the legality, feasibility and deliverability of saving options. I'm just a little bit concerned about sort of cart and horse scenario.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Councillor Jones. I'll try and explain this. So the process is that, so first of all of the proposals have been going through the individual policy and services committees. They've considered those in a budget workshop. They will have made comments. Some of the business cases have already been worked up for those. And the responsibility of the P&R subcommittee or working group will be not to agree or disagree those, but to review those business cases and those proposals to make sure, you know, are they achievable, are they robust, are they realisable, are they legal, so that when that working group or subcommittee reports back to policy and resources as a whole, you have the assurance that, for example, all of these savings, they can all be achieved from the 1st of April. So, you know, there's no delay in something, that we have had an equality impact assessment for all of the savings. You know, all of the staffing implications have been considered. So it's more of a sort of like a governance oversight in terms of those proposals, just to give the assurance to the full committee that actually you have a range of proposals now and you can choose any of these options because they are fully achievable and deliverable from the 1st of April, or indeed if they're not from the 1st of April they have been reduced to take into account some sort of time delay. So they will be presented then to Policy and Resources Committee as a whole, and then Policy and Resources Committee as a whole then will convene a workshop that will assess all of the individual savings from the Policy and Services Committees, whereby in theory, it would be a accept or reject workshop rather than, you know, what specific detail is provided in each of these proposals, because that work will have been done from the subcommittee. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you. That's as clear as mud to me, that now.
So, sorry, just to come off the back of that then, before I bring Tom and then Jean in. I mean, my assumption would be that the individual committees would ensure that any option that comes up is already, they're already satisfied that they're deliverable, achievable, legal, etc.
Yeah, so that's the responsibility of the individual committees. What you have as a policy and resources workshop then is that extra layer of governance, just to make sure that you know, that from your, because you are the committee that needs to set the budget. You need to make sure that those policy and services committees have done a good job, if you like, and that everything is robust and they've not overlooked something. And you can ask all those questions, you know, that you might ask something different that perhaps have not been asked at policy and service committee. So it's just an extra layer of governance, really, to provide the assurance for you, the whole, as a committee.
Okay, yeah. Tom?
I think we're going round in a web of confusion and circles here. But, just two things then. My concern is it's just occurred to me that the consultation will not report until December. So a question in that is, will that consultation then feed into the committees? It doesn't appear that it will, but it might be corrected if I'm wrong. And the second thing is, I don't want to alter any recommendations here. You know, I broadly agree with it, but from the questions that have been asked, the concerns that are now been raised, and some of the confusion, is this possible to bring this timetable to group leaders as well at some point, so we can actually hammer out these details instead of tonight going around in a web of whatever confusion?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, we can bring it to group leaders. So we are in the process of compiling a bit of an easy to read sort of timeline and apologies, yeah. for everybody. I didn't mean any disrespect there, Councillor Anderson. But it'd be like a flow chart, you know, so it's you can see at a glance really, rather than have to go through piles of information. So we will bring that back to group leaders. In terms of your comment with regard to the consultation, depending on the timescales that's agreed, and if you do want to go out to a further consultation, then it may be that there wouldn't be time to go to individual policy and services committees. It would come straight to P&R.
Sorry, I meant the first consultation will be reporting back in December. I don't know all the committee cycles, but will the committees have a chance to consider those?
Yeah, I mean, we can definitely feed it into the individual committees. I'm not entirely sure of the committee dates either in December. The consultation finishes mid-December. I mean, it can be fed in January as well, and any sort of comment. It won't be to the individual committee; it'll be to the budget working group. So as soon as one is convened, we can feed that in straight away.
Yeah, I was just about to suggest it would be helpful if there could be additional, sorry everyone, but additional either committees or working group meetings, because there could be options there that's been agreed or agreed, sort of generally agreed, and then the consultation could come back that could completely change how members think about that. So I would suggest that, unpopular as it is, they would have to have a mechanism whereby the consultation results are fed back to the committees before everything comes up to P&R. Okay, got loads of people want to come in now, so do you just one more from Tom?
Sorry, it's just on what you just said on the back of that. I've got no issue with working groups because they're useful and helpful and talk through the scenarios we're just now. But actually, when a committee makes a recommendation, it's got to be the full committee in public with the opportunity for statements, petitions and questions. So if the committee doesn't have all the full information, it's no, you know, the working group might come up with one thing, but it doesn't give the members of the public to then, you know, engage with that committee as it should under the new constitution. So, you know, I've got a big concern over that.
I think in response to that, you know, if there isn't any committees already factored in, we would have to factor in some additional dates for that to happen.
Okay, next I've got Jean.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, Sharon, I appreciate some of these dates you have no control over because obviously you won't know the spending review and etc and so on. But I deputised last year on P&R, and what unfortunately happened was it went through all the committees, and then it came to P&R because obviously there wasn't enough found, let's say, in the committees, not to want to try and by the committees, because some things weren't palatable. And then P&R spent numerous hours, obviously, then unpicking the committees, what they obviously their green or red lines were obviously on them. So will this not be the same thing with that now? There won't be a budget consultation with the whole of P&R now, it'll go to this smaller committee. But then what happened then was the committees felt a bit, quite rightly, all the committees felt a bit despondent because all the work they'd done had to be unpicked by P&R, not intentionally, because there was a lot of millions and millions of pounds that wasn't achieved to be able to go out for the consultation anyway. So I'm just concerned that we're going to end up without the best intentions in the same cycle, because we are obviously nearly in November, aren't we, the end of this week, and obviously time is a little bit against us, even with all the hard work that's gone into it. So I don't know if you can foresee that with the subcommittees, it's going to have to go backwards and forwards. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Councillor Robinson, we will have to adjust the timetable if we are doing extra consultation and putting extra committees in. So I will bring that back. We do need to kind of stage it to make sure that everybody has an opportunity. You know, all of the committees have an opportunity to feel like they've had a voice and engage within the budget setting. Policy and Resources ultimately does recommend the budget through to full council, so it will be yourselves, you know, have the final say on this. But in the original plan, or in the plan at the moment, there is a plan for Policy and Resources workshop to be held in January to consider all of the proposals that have come back from the policy and services, the individual committees. So there will be that, as I say, it will be a similar process to last year, unfortunately. But what I'll need to do, as I say now, is just go back and have another look at the timetable, just to make sure that it's not, you know, there is enough time for everything to be done before we set the budget.
Yvonne, thanks.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, just moving away from timetables and general diary confusion. Picking up on Councillor Cleary's point about our overall financial strategy, and I would suggest that one of the roles of the Finance Subcommittee is to ensure that the proposals that are coming from the individual committees are consistent with our overall financial strategy and general direction of travel. That's all.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Nolan. Yeah, absolutely right. Yes, if we were agreeing the principles tonight, then all of the budget proposals should be set in line with those. Yeah.
Pat, are you next? Oh. Phil, sorry.
Well, short of suggesting that we put bunk beds here in Floral Pavilion to spend most of the time after Christmas here, I'm just trying to think of a way of working through this. We have 2C in our document of recommendations, which talks about the approach to budget consultation outlined in section 310 of the report, which we're supposed to agree. I'm wondering whether we as a committee we should formally say, with an opportunity taken for further consultation and committee consideration on additional matters as required in any resolution we pass tonight. And that would probably box off some of the concerns that have been raised.
Well, I think we don't need to go to a vote on the bunk beds, do we? But I'm going to bring Phil in.
Bunk beds in the floor. It sounds like the name for a play on the other side. If I may, Chair, so that's the addition, and forgive me if I haven't picked up all of that wording, but with so C is the approach to budget consultation outlined in section 3.10 of the report, with a further consultation and an opportunity for committees to consider before final recommendation from P&R. If required. Thank you. Yes, or as required. Thank you very much. And then just to confirm, all of the service committees, as far as I can see, meet in January and would meet before the key date, I believe, of the 15th of February, which is the budget P&R.
Okay. Do we have a seconder? Okay. Well, no one else has indicated. So, as amended? As altered. I'm happy to move that we accept the recommendations as altered. Do I have a seconder? Thank you. Can we all agree by assent? Thank you, everyone. Thank you for that, Chair. It was a detailed report, and it certainly is been received, well. But there are some concerns about fitting everything in. And, it's a fact, isn't it? It's the budget we've got to set, so it'll take as many meetings as it takes, I guess. Thanks. Thank you, everyone.